Welcome to our migration history talk. Today we have the honor to have with us Professor Candan Badem. Our guest is an associate professor of history whose research has focused on Ottoman Russian borderlands. Due to the suppression of academic freedom in Turkey, our guest has been a scholar at risk. In the last few years, he was a scholarship holder at the Jagiellonian University in Krakow and a visiting researcher at Uppsala University. Currently, he's a visiting fellow at the Oxford Nizami Ganjavi Center. His book, The Ottoman Crimean War, published in 2010, greatly contributed to the rich, albeit Anglo-centric, historiography of the conflict by providing the under-researched Ottoman perspective of the war and offering new insights into its financial, social, and political implications for the Ottoman Empire. Since then, Candan Badem has contributed to numerous publications with articles and book chapters in several languages on the Crimean War and beyond, with a particular focus on Russian and Ottoman administration of imperial borderlands during the second half of the 19th century. I would also like to highlight the book that our guest has recently edited, the Routledge Handbook of the Crimean War in 2021, which brought together some of the most prominent scholars on the topic to shed light on less known aspects and stages of the war, from diplomacy, military strategy, the Baltic stage, technological advances, and cultural impacts to population displacement. Today, our guest will tell us about the Crimean War within the context of the Eastern Question and migrations from Russia to the Ottoman Empire in the 19th century. After the presentation, the esteemed audience will have time to ask questions. I now give the word to our speaker, Candan Badem.
Thank you. Thank you, colleagues, friends, students. I'm honored to be in this university. This is my first time in Switzerland. And my topic today is a bit broad, and the Crimean War itself is a broad topic, is a great war, almost a world war, and the Eastern Question is another wide question, migrations, and again, so to talk about all of them in this allotted time is a bit difficult, but yeah, let me begin by giving some context on the 19th century Russo-Ottoman Wars, the wars of Russian expansion and Ottoman decline, or some don't like this word decline, let's say disintegration, which caused the Eastern Question. The so-called Eastern Question was the question of how to divide the legacy of the Ottoman Empire, what to do in the face of the disintegrating Ottoman Empire, and in the age of nationalism in 19th century, how to support or not support those non-Muslim peoples, especially in the Balkans, Europe, part of the Ottoman Empire, beginning with, of course, this famous case of the Greek War of Independence. So the last Ottoman century, from 1822 till 1922, when the Ottoman Empire finally and officially disintegrated. In this last Ottoman century, there are many Russo-Ottoman wars in this century, and the Greeks, and then Serbians, Romanians, Bulgarians, Montenegrins, the last Albanians all gained independence. And Russia as an expanding empire was a decisive factor in all these national struggles and wars between Ottomans and Russia. The Russian Empire was numerically more populous. It had a larger base of recruitment for its armies than the Ottomans, because the Ottomans recruited for its armies only the Muslims, whereas Russia had a larger population and could also use its own Muslim population in a more efficient way, whereas Ottomans were reluctant in that respect. Although the Crimean War changed many aspects of Ottoman political life, but still it was a slow process. And the Crimean War, happening in the middle of the 19th century, from 1853 to 56, was a turning point, and the only war when Ottomans were among the victors. It was when Russia claimed to be a protecting power, having a protectorate over the Orthodox population of Ottoman Empire. And Orthodox means the followers of the Orthodox Church, the Orthodox Millet, Rum Millet, which includes Greeks, but not only Greeks, others as well. So Russian Emperor Tsar Nicholas I tried to assert his will on the Ottoman Empire, but he made a big mistake of misreading the conjuncture or the situation in Europe. And this led to a Russian diplomatic isolation. Russian demands of having the power to represent the Orthodox millet, of course, were rejected by the Ottomans. And Russia, in turn, Russian armies invaded the two Ottoman dominions of Wallachia and Moldova, today's, and Eflak and Bogdan, terminology, this today's Romania. These two principalities were autonomous, but still part of the empire, still dependencies or dominions of the Ottoman Empire. And when Russia invaded them, European great powers, Britain and France, sided with the Ottoman government, the Sublime Porte, and soon war broke out. At first, Ottomans were alone fighting the Russians, but then France and Britain also came to the aid, and the war. Right.
I think it's enough.
Yeah. So the war. So the war became a European war, major European war, and I call it a proto-world war, because all the great powers of the world at that time were either actively or indirectly involved in it. France, Britain, and then the Austrian Empire was also actively engaged in diplomatic negotiations, and Sweden also was about to enter the war. But the war finally came to a diplomatic solution after the Allies destroyed the Russian naval base in Sevastopol in Crimea. And the Russian military, although defeated, could continue the war, but the economic blockade of Russia from the Turkish Straits and also from the Baltic Sea made it economically impossible for Russia to continue the war. So Russia was forced to agree to the Paris Peace Treaty, which, among other things, brought equality of non-Muslims in the Ottoman Empire, political equality of non-Muslims with Muslims, which meant that non-Muslim subjects would become statesmen, although not military positions, because the Ottoman army was reluctant to enroll its non-Muslim, which means basically Christian subject, into its army. So as you can see, there are so many wars in the 19th century where the Ottoman Empire was involved, and all these wars brought waves of migration from Russia and from the Balkans into the core, not only the core territory, but basically the core territory of the empire, which is today's Turkey or Anatolia, the Anatolian part of Turkey. But migration from Russia began even before the 19th century, when towards the end of 18th century, Russia annexed the Crimean Khanate into its empire. The Crimean Tatars and Nogais, Turkic peoples, started to migrate into the Ottoman Empire. This is a map of the Ottoman Empire at the beginning of the 19th century. You see there are still European parts, Balkans, within the empire. So the first migrations were towards the area between Bulgaria and Romania today, Dobruja. But as the empire retreated, shrank in size, some of the refugees, the muhajirs, were they had to take again a journey, this time towards Ottoman Anatolia and towards Syria, which was again part of the Ottoman Empire. So this Arabic word muhajir, which means both migrant, emigrant, and a refugee, all of them is included in the meaning of muhajir, was a buzzword in 19th century European or Ottoman diplomacy. And yeah, as I said, the Russian emperor thought that politics were decided by the personal tastes of political leaders, monarchs like himself. So he could not understand why the English, the British conservatives were having lands sporting some revolutionary incidents against Russia, because he thought he is an autocrat and conservative, and the British government is also conservative. Why should they be against Russian conservatives? But the fact was that Russia was seen as a threat not only to Ottomans, but to Europe as well. And even Austria, which was helped by the troops of Nicholas during the revolution of 1848 against the Hungarian revolutionaries, still wasn't on the side of Russia, on the side of Russian claims of the protectorate over the Ottoman Orthodox Christians. Meanwhile, Ottomans were no longer a great power, although they considered themselves still a great power, but still a considerable force in European politics. And in this term, sick man of Europe belongs to Nicholas. He tried to make an agreement, a gentleman's agreement with the British politicians, of dividing the territories of Ottomans. He said, I will not take Constantinople, which was the crown of the jewel of the crown, the biggest prize of the empire, but I will not let other powers take it too. So Constantinople should remain somehow international or belong to a small Greek state, but other parts are negotiable. And with the hindsight, we can say Nicholas was simply straightforward and honest, because in the end it came to exactly to a partitioning of the Ottomans. I mean, the British and the French finally agreed with Russia during World War I. As you know, the Sykes-Picot Agreement was about how to divide the Ottoman territories. But in the 19th century, European powers preferred a weak Ottoman Empire, and they didn't like, of course, Russian influence on the Ottomans. Yeah, this is a Black Sea theater of war of the Crimean War, and I think I should move more towards migration. And there is the Baltic theater, again blockade of Russia by sea, and yeah, the Crimean Tatars, of course, were affected most by the Crimean War. They were seen as enemies by Russian authorities, and after the war, rumors were spreading that Russia plans to, take them into a Russian army, and even to possibly Christianize them. Such rumors were circulating, and some Nogais going through the Crimean Peninsula were also spreading such rumors. So soon after the war, a great wave of immigration began from the Crimea into the Ottoman Empire. Approximately 200,000 Tatars emigrated. There are estimations of numbers of muhajirs into the Ottoman Empire. For example, Kemal Karpat and Justin McCarthy have given some numbers. Roughly 5 million seems to be a reasonable number of all immigrants from Russia and the Balkans in the last half century of the Ottomans. And yeah, Russia had its Caucasus war against the mountain peoples, the so-called mountain peoples of the Caucasus, and Here you can see the Russian point of view, the official Russian point of view. I took it from the website of a Russian archive, so it fairly represents the official Russian view. And it says that, well, as you can read, this process was not dictated by the desire of the Russian Empire to destroy the Caucasian peoples, and so on. I mean, I cannot go into the details of all this war and the ensuing migration of Caucasian peoples, Circassians, Ossetians, the Abkhaz. But of course, there was pressure from Russia and an invitation from the Ottoman Sultan. But the Ottomans also miscalculated the situation. They thought the number of muhajirs would not be great, but in the end, they could not handle those muhajirs. And it turned into a great tragedy or genocide, which is again a debatable point, but from the point of view of these peoples, it's a genocide. And indeed, it has many similarities with the Armenian genocide of 1915. But there are so many details which makes it complicated because Russia, yes, forced these Circassians, these Muslims, to emigrate, gave them two options: either resettle in the plainlands of Kuban or among Russian Cossacks. Russian Cossacks were a warlike tribe or community, and to live among them was, of course, not an attractive aspect for Circassians. So the second option was to emigrate to the Ottomans, and the Ottoman Sultan, at that time Sultan Abdulaziz, was inviting them, but he had no idea how many people will come and where to. I mean, maybe not where to, because Ottoman Anatolia still had some unused land, but Russia argues that it was due to the Ottomans' inefficiency and fault that these muhajirs suffered from diseases, from hunger, and from not finding shelters and so on. And yeah, this was a great tragedy or genocide. Then came the next war, the Russo-Ottoman War of 1877-78, and it began because of the so-called Bulgarian Horrors a year before, when Ottomans used the Muhajir Circassians, who had been terrorized by Russia and resettled in Ottoman Bulgaria. Ottomans used them as irregular troops. Başibozuk is the famous Ottoman term for regular troops, against Bulgarian insurgents or revolutionaries, because there was a revolt in Bosnia and Ottoman troops were in Bosnia, and in Bulgaria, when the Bulgarian revolutionaries also revolted, there wasn't enough troops, so Ottomans used those Başibozuks from Muslim muhajirs, and these muhajirs inflicted terror onto Christians of Bulgaria. And this event was much publicized in the European press, as horrors and atrocities against Christians. So this time, the European public opinion was not on the side of Ottoman Empire, unlike during the Crimean War, when all the European public opinion was on the Ottoman side. But now Ottomans didn't have that support, so they were left alone vis-à-vis Russia, and Russia defeated ultimately Ottomans in the Balkans and in the Caucasian front. So there was another great migration movement from the Balkans and from the Caucasus. And this time, Ottoman Sultan was Abdülhamit II, who was an active sultan, unlike others, the two sultans before him. And at the Berlin Treaty, the great powers had obliged the Ottomans to guarantee the security of Armenians in Ottoman Eastern Anatolia, or Ottoman Armenia, against the Circassians and the Kurds. The Circassians were, of course, the Muhajirs. Kurds were native. But Abdülhamit didn't want to implement those reforms, like giving more representative power to local Armenians in the provincial administration. Instead, he temporized and he started forming his regiments from Kurdish cavalry and from Muhajirs. And those Muhajirs from Russia were incorporated in many cases into the Ottoman army and into Ottoman irregular forces given at later times. Yeah, and this policy against the Ottoman policy vis-a-vis the question of this Hajir problem, until the war of 1878 was basically religious. It was a necessity of the ideological legitimation of the Ottoman Sultan, right? He was supposed to provide shelter to Muslims who was fleeing from non-Muslim forces. That's the Arabic word muhajir has the same root as hijra, which meant the hijra of Muslims from Mecca to Medina during the first years of Islam. So until this war, it was a question of religious legitimation and also gaining loyal taxpayers and tillers of land, because there was still unused land in Ottoman Anatolia and also in other parts of Arabic parts of the empire. But this policy after the war changed into a policy of demographic engineering, a more modern, nationalistically driven policy of demographic engineering and creating buffers and trying to prevent non-Muslims being a majority or a plurality in any part of the core territory of the empire in Anatolia. And the Young Turk government, which defeated Abdülhamit and formed a government in the second constitutional revolution of 1908, carried this policy into its climactic point of ethnic cleansing and the Armenian genocide of 1915. And some of, or even many of the Muhajirs were employed in paramilitary organizations. Yeah, I'm concluding. The special organization Teşkilat-ı Mahsusa had a special role during World War I. Here is a map where you can see the large picture of migrations, Muslim displacement, basically from Russia and the Balkans into Ottoman Empire. This map was prepared by Justin McCarthy. Justin McCarthy has made a contribution into Muslim displacement, but I find his arguments at times biased against non-Muslims like Armenians of Turkey, of Ottoman Empire, because he also argues that, for example, Ottoman Armenians fought on the side of Russia during the Crimean War, for example. I have done extensive research on the Crimean War. I mean, at least the Crimean War I think I know well. So there are no Ottoman Armenians fighting in Russian army. Russia had its own Armenians, but Ottoman Armenians did not fight in the Russian armies. And on the contrary, there were petitions from some Ottoman Armenians to join the Ottoman army against Russia, but they were rejected. Even during the Crimean War, that's mid-19th century, some Armenians applied to the Ottoman government as volunteers, as kind of başıbozuk, right, to fight against Russia. So, yeah, but the map gives an idea, you know, it's, as you can see, complicated. From all former Ottoman territories, Muslims had to flee into the core lands because ethnic cleansing and nation state formation in the Balkans was violent for all, of course. It was violent for Muslims and for non-Muslims. And here is another map from the official Turkish television. And again, from the official Turkish TV, there is a quote from Ataturk, which says, "Muhajirs are national memories of our abandoned countries," which might mean, you know, many things, but yeah, because in the Turkish Republic, after the Ottoman Empire, Muhajirs constituted roughly 1/3 of the population, which means roughly 1/3 of Turkish population today are Muhajirs. I have omitted the Balkan Wars, but let's pass over. Yeah, and one aspect of this Muslim displacement from Russia into the Ottoman Empire was the return migration, because the Ottomans could not provide enough help to these Muhajirs. A great part of them, sometimes half of them, returned to Russia. And this is one of the less studied aspects of migration. Return migration should be study more, I think. I did some research on the muhajirs from Kars area, Kars and Batum, which means from the Turkish point of view, it's the northeastern Anatolia. Northeastern Anatolia. But from a Caucasian point of view, it is Southwest Caucasus. The muhajirs from Southwest Caucasus, for example, were more than 100,000, but some half of them returned, and we don't know exact figures. The Russian state had records of those who departed, but those who returned, and most of them illegally, were not recorded. So, to conclude, Muslim displacement in the last Ottoman century was driven by nation-state formation, ethnic cleansing, Russian imperial expansion, and Ottoman disintegration. And sometimes there were unintended consequences of this expansion or of Ottoman willingness to take in muhajirs. But since my time is coming to an end, I will answer questions. And both Russian push and Ottoman pull factors were decisive in this whole process. Sometimes not only religious, but simply economic reasons also played. Some, for example, Tatars from the heart of Russia, from Volga, just migrated because of economic problems or drought or crop failures. So it means it's again a complicated process, not only wars and political factors, but simply economic factors also played a role. And another factor was the Ottoman clergy, propaganda by Ottoman Muslim clergy in those parts of Ottoman Empire which were annexed to Russia. The clergy didn't want to live under Russian administration, and while they were migrating, they tried to drive other Muslims together with them to take them with themselves. And nobility also played a role. Circassian nobility, for example, were afraid of losing their privileges after the peasant reform in Russia, which was also a more or less direct result of the Crimean War. This abolition of serfdom in Russia meant also a threat for example, Muslim Circassian nobility who had their slaves and their dependent peasants, and they thought they wouldn't have these privileges, so they wanted to migrate into Ottoman Empire, and while migrating, they wanted to take their slaves and dependent peasants because those people were their source of income. I think, yeah, time is up. Thank you for your patience.
So now we'll open the floor to some questions. I will take the notes if there are more than one people to ask questions. Who wants to start? Yes.
All right, I can start. Thank you, Professor, for a highly interesting explanation of this migration. My question more, had you said a third after the collapse of the empire, Ottoman Empire was a third where Bulgaria. What is left today of this migration in modern Turkey?
So,
What is left today
Of what?
in modern Turkey of this migration, which were quite important.
Which migration you mean specifically?
Migration that you mentioned in all these Circassians and the
Circassians and others.
yeah, today, is that still present or is it completely integrated?
Yeah, thank you. Yes, a good question. When Circassians are a good example of a very successful assimilation. I mean, this might not be good for them, but the fact is, Circassians in Turkey have been assimilated. Most of them do not speak their language. And the policy of the Turkish Republic was very strongly Turkish nationalism, denying any other ethnic identity. All were considered Turks. They weren't allowed to have their schools. And although Circassians themselves were also, unlike Kurds, for example, who are an authentic people, Circassians were, let's say, in most cases, willing to assimilate into the Turkish nation. It wasn't a much trouble process. It was almost smooth, but still, of course, not for all Circassians. If you ask them, of course, they will also tell their problems with this policy of Turkification. But even today, there are Circassians are overrepresented in many Turkish institutions, like Turkish intelligence. I believe there are more Circassians than their proportion in the population. And in the army, so yeah, these muhajirs from the Caucasus, I mean, let's say non-Turkish muhajirs, right? The Turks are as Turks, they have no problems. But non-Turkish Muslim muhajirs have been assimilated by state policies, by force. But this wasn't as violent as in the case of the Kurds, right? Kurds are different. I hope this answers.
Yeah, I mean, just a similar question. Is this also same for Armenians that are still in Turkey today, and perhaps the muhajirs from present day or former Yugoslavia, say Albania, Kosovo, Bosnia? Are they also assimilated in the same way, these Circassians?
Yes, Bosnian Muslims, Bosniaks, have also been assimilated, and some of them even reject the idea of giving them education in their language, for example. They have become so Turkified that they don't want themselves to be considered as in the same level with Kurds, for example. They don't want to be seen as separatists. As for Armenians, there are very few Armenians in Turkey. And I mean, we can compare Turkey, present-day Turkey, with, let's say, Greece and, well, Bulgaria, right? Both Greek and Bulgarian nationalism also committed atrocities, massacres against Muslims, their Muslims, that's a fact. But still, in Bulgaria and Greece, today, there is a Muslim Turkish population of around 8%. Whereas in Turkey, total number of Greeks, Bulgarians, Armenians, and all non-Muslims is not even 1%. So in that sense, Turkey is a more nationalistic force, maybe. But all nationalisms are violent. In the case of Armenians, there is the genocide, and even today, the Armenians in Turkey are not enjoying even the rights given by the Treaty of Lausanne, the treaty which provided the independence of modern Turkey, right? Treaty of Lausanne, 1923, gave rights to non-Muslim minorities. But in practice, some of these rights are not practiced in Turkey. So there are, I think, some 70,000 Armenians in Turkey, basically in Istanbul. But if we add Armenia, another nation state on the border with Turkey, they are also very, let's say, unmixing. They have, even during the Soviet time, Armenia was ethnically very monotonous, very monolithic. All other Soviet republics had non-titular nations to some extent in their republics. Armenia was 98% Armenian. But Armenia is a small republic, and to compare it with Turkey doesn't make much sense. But still, if you compare, that's also a fact. Yeah.
Thank you for your talk. I was very interested in this word muhajir, and I wondered, well, first of all, if it's apparently a word to describe a very, very heterogeneous group of refugees, right? And you said it meant immigrant, emigrant, and refugee all at the same time. And I was wondering if, was that a word that originated at that time, so around 1800, when these people started moving towards or into the Ottoman Empire and used this word? Was it, you know, a category that only Ottoman authorities used, or did, for example, these groups themselves ever describe themselves as muhajir?
Yes, good question. There was another word used for refugees, another Arabic word Ottomans used, mülteci. It meant muhajir, non-Muslim muhajir, practically. Although these two terms sometimes overlapped. In the 18th century, Ottomans used the word muhajir not only for Muslims, but others as well. Although in most cases, because of the religious connotation, muhajir meant a Muslim who was forced to flee from a non-Muslim power. Like the first Muslims fleeing from the pagans of Mecca, that was called hijra, and muhajir meant those who fled from pagans. So this religious connection is obvious, but there are few examples when the word muhajir included non-Muslims as well. And the word mülteci was used, for example, for those Hungarian revolutionaries who took refuge in the Ottoman Empire after the failed revolution of 1848 in Austria-Hungary. They were called mülteci, whereas Muslims coming from Russia or the Balkans were called muhajir. And muhajir was a positive word from an Islamic point of view. And whereas mülteci didn't have that positive meaning.
And how about the Jews expelled from Spain in 1492, who for many found a shelter in the Ottoman Empire? Was there a distinct terminology, or?
I don't know. I mean, the Jews were accepted, yes, into the Ottoman Empire. They didn't go only to the Ottoman Empire, but the Ottomans took a lot of Jews, and the city of Salonika, for example, had a sizable Jewish population, a plurality maybe, if not, not majority, but a plurality in Salonika. But the Jews were also, during the Republican period in Turkey, by various methods, forced to migrate from Turkey. There were, let's say, pogroms against Jews as well. But under the Ottomans, the Jews were a small community. The Jewish millet was very small, and they weren't seen as a threat. The question of Palestine is a later development, but during most of the 19th century, the Jewish millet wasn't seen as a threat.
In North Africa, I mean, that was not significant even in Algeria or...
Jews in Algeria. Algeria was not part of the Ottoman Empire.
It was part of the...
I mean, was
until
before the 19th century, but in the 19th century, it's already gone. So.
And what is the present day terminology for refugees in Turkey?
Muhacir is not used officially. You have the term mülteci, but for example, the Syrians, 5 million Syrian, how to call them, refugees, let's say, are not officially refugees. Turkey does not consider them officially as mülteci, as a refugee, but they are called temporary asylum seeker, geçici sığınmacı. There is this Turkish word sığınmacı. Our friend Alexander Balistri maybe can translate it into English.
Asylum seeker.
Yeah. Because the refugee has legal rights, which are defined by some international agreements and European Union legislation. So when Turkey signed that European Convention, he made an exception. So Turkey doesn't give the status of full refugee to people from Syria, for example, but gives a kind of temporary status, like temporary asylum seeker. But they are allowed to work. They are have access to health services, and they are accepted into Turkish schools, children. And the word for them, in practice, in most cases you say mülteci, but not muhacir. Muhacir isn't. When you say muhacir, you have in mind those people who came during the Ottoman times.
Right. It doesn't resonate so much anymore, or at least it's only an historical category that is not widely used anymore.
Well, and I guess these people aren't migrating from a Christian or pagan power. They would be fleeing civil war. I don't know if they would still be called muhajirs in that case. But I wanted to bring the question back to the 19th century because in all of this, I think one would see a shift in ideology regarding migration. You talked about muhajir having a kind of positive connotation. One should be a muhajir, right? Because you shouldn't be living under a Christian power. You should be living in this Muslim power that's going to protect you. So in, let's say, the middle of the 19th century, migrants felt the need to go. But by the 20th century, there was a shift, and nationalists were trying to keep migrants in, or keep people in their place and forcing them not to migrate. So when like Russia or Armenia would take over parts of Turkey after World War I, Teşkilat-ı Mahsusa was there trying to force Muslims to stay in their villages and not to be muhajirs. So this seems to be a shift, like a pro-migration to anti-migration shift that also has to do with the rise of nationalism. I was wondering if you see the same shift as well, if you agree that there is a shift, or, and if so, where it comes from.
Yeah, I agree that there is a shift in Ottoman policy towards more nationalism, towards more Turkish nationalism, ethnic nationalism, and of course towards creating a Turkish homeland, ethnically pure, which should include Muslims and Turks, or those Muslims who could be assimilated into the Turkish nation. And as regards the policy of Russia, the Russian policy wasn't linear, right? Russia did not always, as you said, encourage its Muslims to emigrate to the Ottoman Empire. As you have studied Kars Ardahan area, Russia there took a more or less neutral position, did not force Muslims to emigrate to the Ottomans. And on the contrary, there were instances, for example, in Batum, when the Russian authorities tried to keep the population because Russia was trying to prove to the whole world, or to the Muslim world, that it was a benevolent empire with its own Muslims, and Russian Muslims, population number of Russian Muslims was roughly equal to Ottoman Muslims. Russia had a very sizable Muslim population, and in its own legitimation of its civilizing mission, like all empires, it was trying to show that Muslims are integrated into the imperial society, and I agree that they were more successful than the Ottomans in that sense to integrate their Muslims. Russia integrated its Muslims into its bureaucracy and society better than the Ottomans integrated non-Muslims into its bureaucracy. Yeah, so Russia did not always, especially after this war of 1878, Russia did not, at least in the Caucasus, try to force Muslims out. But in the Balkans, of course, it wasn't the Russians, it was the local nationalists who did the work. For example, I mean, there was some kind of solidarity between them. Russian Cossacks, for example, would encircle a Muslim village, and the Bulgarian nationalists would come and do the massacre. Russia wouldn't let its own soldiers do massacres, but they would also not prevent it. So are they responsible? Of course they are responsible to a certain extent. But who did the massacre? It was the local nationalists. Yeah.
I also have a question in that sense, which would be, in this, basically in these migration patterns following the Crimean War, how would you place them in the policy of Russification? Because we know with Minutin, after the Polish uprising, it was pursued this kind of policy of Russification. But between the end of the Crimean War and '63, there were great debates about how to do it and if Russification was indeed the answer to these questions. So how would you place basically these patterns of migration into the Ottoman Empire from Russia in this policy of Russification? And a bit of a counterfactual, let's say, a counterfactual question. Do you think that without this policy of Russification that there would be such a massive immigration of Muslims from Russia?
I believe, first of all, that the real question was economic or land question. Russia wanted those Muslim territories because it had to give territory to its own Cossacks. And but Russian policy fluctuated. After the Crimean War, Alexander II was seen as a liberator Tsar, who liberated to a certain extent peasantry and who was more or less liberal. But then he was assassinated, and the next Russian Tsar, Alexander III, was inclined more towards Russification. And the official Russian ideology, as you know, had three words: autocracy, orthodoxy, and narodnost, which meant nationality. Yeah, but the word narod in Russian is a bit complicated. Yeah. It might mean populism, but they used it as a substitute for the French word nationalité or nation. So yeah, this policy of narodnost or nationality, official nationality, meant at least during Alexander III and Nicholas the Second, Russification. But Russification had an impact not only on Muslims, but also on Christian peoples like the Armenians. The Armenian church property was confiscated towards the end of 19th century, and then it was given back after the revolution of 1905. So Russification, yeah, was even the rumor of it, even if it did not take actual shape, even the rumors of some Russification steps, let's say, steps towards Russification or towards denial of religious rights. Because in the case of Armenians, religion and nationality, ethnicity was intertwined, had an impact. So Muhajirs would listen to those rumors. For example, Muslims didn't want to serve in the Russian military. That was also seen as a policy of Russification. If you take Muslims into the Russian army, this would, even the rumor of this would cause many people to emigrate. And also rumors about some pressure or oppression of the religious clergy would also lead to migration. But Russian policy was fluctuating after the revolution of 1905, there was certain liberal policies, let's say, and yeah, eventually the Muslims of Russia, although most of them, or a great part of them, migrated to Ottoman Empire, eventually half of them returned, which means still, comparatively, Russia was, in some sense, had a better system or better means of integration of Muslims than the Ottomans. I find the Russian administration more successful in comparison to the Ottoman administration. Even, I mean, this Tatars, for example, the Tatars of Russia were better integrated into a, let's say, not Russian, but more secular way of life. And they had the first nationalistic ideas came from some Tatar intelligence into the Ottoman Empire. They were more secular and more nationalistic. Probably the Russian system made them think more in nationalistic ideology than the Ottoman Muslims themselves. Because Ottoman Muslims, the peasants in Anatolia, for example, still considered themselves as Muslims and not Turks. And for some of them, Turk meant a rude person.
There was still a fair amount of discrimination against Tatars in Russia.
Yes.
Perhaps they had to assimilate because the discrimination was so vile. We have, for example, political manifests saying that what we have bad here is a consequence of the Tatar history in this region, and there is a big amount of discrimination against the Tatars, as far as I know, in Russia. So perhaps that also played a role.
You mean in the Russian Empire or
in the Russian Empire?
Yeah.
Russian Empire.
And you mean by Tatars the Crimeans or
The Crimean.
Oh yeah. I mean, historically, Russians, again, I'm playing the devil's advocate, right? Have their grudges against Crimean Tatars because for centuries, Crimean Tatars were raiding Russian villages and taking their boys and girls into slavery and selling them at the port of Kefe, today's Feodosia, to Ottomans or to even European Genoese slave traders. So, yeah, but who hasn't in history any grudge against others? You know, everybody has their grudges and historical issues, unresolved issues. So, from a Russian point of view, Crimean Tatars, and not only the Crimean nobility, the whole Crimean Tatar population, and I mean, very great part of it were involved in those raids into Ukraine and into Russian territory to take slaves and sell them in the market. So, yeah, but this, of course, doesn't justify Russian policy in the 19th century. Of course, Russian policy towards the Crimean Tatars during the Crimean, War, for example, what could the poor Tatars do? They had, of course, sympathies towards Ottomans and their allies, but they didn't know the outcome of the war. because exactly as they feared, although the Allies and Ottomans won the war against Russia, Crimea was still in Russian hands. So those Tatars would still remain under Russian administration. And the Tatar collaboration, let's say, with the Ottomans and Allies was minimal during the Crimean War. But despite that, Russian troops, especially the Cossacks, were violent towards Tatars, forcing them to migration, stealing their cattle, taking bribes against them, considering them as enemies of the state. Yeah, so this, but then as I said, Russian policy fluctuates. After a violent period comes a more or less relaxation period. But then even rumors of some Muslims being subjected to pressure, or not rumors, actual, let's say, deportation, again creates a wave of migration in Crimea also. Yeah, Crimean Tatars are very complicated. During the Second World War, they were also collaborating with the Nazi army. So this led to another expulsion of Tatars from the peninsula. And yeah, their story is tragic. They were deprived of their homeland because they were caught between big forces like empires clashing, and those small numbered peoples had little choices. The Circassians, for example, also had this problem, and they came to Turkey. Some of them are in, for example, the Jordan, the Arabic Republic of Jordan has a very sizable Circassian population. The capital of Jordan itself, Amman, was a Circassian Muhajir village, not even city, and it grew into a capital of a country. Yeah.
If I may, something that you discussed at length in the paper, but also in your talk, is basically the ethnic engineering of the Tsarist empire at the time. It's kind of selective, and that's not always clear, but it seems that there were some groups that were more desirable than others. Some of them were actively chased out of the territory, and I guess it was not only about religion, but it was also about economic concerns and perhaps loyalty, and perhaps the need to redeem themselves and demonstrate that they were a bit more benevolent than their neighbors. But one thing that is missing in your story, which is already quite broad, but I would just like to hear, but it's probably broad enough. But I was wondering, the ethno-demographic concerns, I guess, were the same on the Ottoman side in terms of managing or trying to influence the destination and the composition of the different immigration flows coming from Russia at the time. So what was the kind of ethno-demographic strategy of the Ottoman Empire? Were they trying to do some ethnic engineering, basically, to make sure that they would locate and settle in specific territories, perhaps because those lands were empty or because they were populated by undesirable groups from the perspective of the Ottomans? I mean, to what extent were they trying to address the phenomenon using the same kind of ethno-demographic tools?
Yeah, in the late Ottoman period, that is period of Abdülhamid II and the Young Turk government, Armenians were the main issue because the Armenian revolutionaries were pursuing the same path that was used by Balkan nationalists, right? First, they create insurgency and then cause massacres by the Ottomans, and then get the attention of European powers, and then begin a new war against the Ottoman Empire. And only in this way they thought they could set up independent Armenia. But this does not, of course, mean that all Ottoman Armenians were such revolutionaries. These revolutionaries were a minority within the Armenian community. But Abdulhamid and the Young Turks saw them as a problem. Young Turks at first had some solidarity against the despotism of Abdulhamid with the Armenian revolutionaries. But soon, when they came to power, they started applying the most radical ethnic cleansing policy, which culminated in the Armenian genocide, because there was this sense of defeat. They saw that they would lose all lands except the core territory, Anatolia. So, but Anatolia was populated by Greeks, Armenians, and Kurds. Kurds were Muslims. They could be integrated somehow. Greeks, Ottoman Greeks, were not seen as harmful as Armenians, but the Armenian nationalism was seen as a threat. And even Russian Empire also saw Armenian nationalism as a threat to itself. When Russia invaded Eastern Anatolia during the World War I, the Russian authorities gave some hopes to Armenians and even used some Armenian irregular forces, like Armenian Bashibozuks within the Russian army. But when these Armenian Bashibozuks started massacres against Muslims, Russia disbanded those Armenian units. The Russian army did not like the activities of those Armenian voluntary units. So they were disbanded, and this also created a problem of Russian Armenians with the authorities in St. Petersburg. But in the case of the Ottoman Empire, the Armenians were subjected to the worst kind of ethnic cleansing. And of course, it's a question in historiography and in politics, how do you differentiate a forced migration from a genocide, right?
From an ethnic cleansing, from a genocide, it's a bit easier, maybe.
Yeah. My point is like this, any state can relocate, or relocate is the better term. It's some part of its population as seen as a threat in terms of security during war, especially. Okay, you can deport them or you can relocate them to other parts of your territory. But if that state doesn't take measures to provide the minimum of living conditions for the deported or relocated population, then it becomes a genocide because you are condemning them to death. You know for certain that they will die. If you leave them, for example, if you leave a person in the desert without food and without water, you know that he will die, right?
No, sure. They're not mutually exclusive strategies, but my question was rather not so much how the Ottoman Empire was treating its own minority problem, dealing with its own minority problem, but rather how, for instance, the Circassian, where did they settle in the Ottoman Empire, and did the empire have some kind of a policy to encourage the settlement in specific regions and not in others?
Yeah.
Or disperse a policy, or, you know.
Ottomans had a policy of resettling the Muhajirs in, for example, around Istanbul as a buffer. Buffers against threats from the east, among Kurds, among Armenians especially, so that nowhere in Anatolia, Armenians or Greeks would constitute a majority or plurality, because the Treaty of Berlin of 1878 had stipulated that the Ottomans would make reforms in the 6 eastern vilayets, provinces in the eastern part of Turkey. In these provinces, Armenians were a plurality, and in some cities a majority. For example, in the city of Van, Armenians were a majority, but not in the whole province, because in the villages there were Kurds more than Armenians. So the Ottoman policy was to, first of all, relocate Muhajirs, let's say Circassian Muhajirs, as a kind of counterweight against Armenians. But on the other hand, the Ottomans also didn't want the Circassians or other Muhajirs to have a majority in a place. This was a constant struggle between the Ottoman authorities and the Muhajirs, because Muhajirs wanted to settle en masse, whereas the Ottomans wanted to scatter them. I mean, even among Muslims, right? Let's say Muslim Turks and Circassians, Muhajirs, they don't constitute a threat, but still, the first policy of the Ottoman Empire was to scatter them into villages, not to allow them to set up whole villages. But when this policy failed, they eventually allowed them to have their villages, for example. And when Anatolia was saturated, Syria was used as a destination for Muhajirs. So you have many Muhajirs in Syria and in Circassians, in Jordan, in Lebanon, and so on.
If there aren't any questions, I would say that we would thank Candan Badem for the presentation and for answering our questions, and we would finish now.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. This is Christina Schulz, I mentioned earlier, who's the head of the history department.